You're not afraid of the dark, are you?
Um, Today, I wanted to just do a short presentation, real quick. When we talk about the circumstances that's going on in our communities, um, when you see the lopsided economical situation or positions that Black people are in this country, it just really kind of made me sit back for a moment and just think about, like, all right, how else can we not only attack the issue, but just reveal the fact that this is a continuous issue that's been going on with us. So I started digging in the crates, and I found in the Negro Digest of January illustration 1963. Um, I felt that I need to find the subject matter that's related to today. So here it is. You see that the major article that was written in 63, Negroes versus Other Minorities in America's Cities, the Ghetto Game. I said, man, this is right on time. So let me do a presentation on it. And in this presentation, I'm gonna read the article with you. You're gonna see the article on your screen. But I wanted to show you how nothing has ever changed. And this is in a timely fashion, seeing as though what's going on with the Johnson Company with their publication with Ebony, in the inability to digitalize the work that they have. So, no further ado, let me just go ahead and get started on this article, because it's a nice lengthy one, and I want you to really see what they're talking about. All right, so the once again the article is entitled "Negroes versus Other Minorities in America's Cities: The Ghetto Game." All right, so if you go into the publication, right, you'll see. I'm going to, you go to the next page. You see right here the Ghetto Game on page 83. All right, as you see, top right corner, January 1963, and this was volume, 12, number three. All right, 1963, guys. I'm going to just kind of really illustrate that. So we're going to click on that for a moment. All right, Negroes versus Other Minorities in America: The Ghetto Game by Dennis Clark. Um, he originally wrote it in 1962, but then he came out a year later. And he says, although it is an old familiar story to Negroes in metropolitan areas, a recently published study probes the hierarchy pattern of urban living within or wherein Negroes are assigned the treadmill level on the stairwell to status. And it seems like that's what we're still going through. All right. So it starts off one of the most notable factors affecting the movement of the Negroes and other people of color in the urban centers has been the persistence of residual belts and islands of ethnic groups in older neighborhoods. These concentrated ethnic groups have greatly influenced opinion and expectations about minorities. Historically, the immigrant foreign language groups established the American form of the ghetto pattern in the large cities. Their segregation was partly forced, but partly voluntarily, permitting exit for those who were amenable to assimilation with the general population. These ethnic enclaves, with their traditionally inferior living conditions, were the matrix for later and larger Negro segregation areas, meaning when they were able to move, we come in. When the Great Negro Migration to the cities began around World War I, the ethnic groups were a very considerable portion of the urban population. In 1920, the foreign born represented 13% of our population. As late of 1950, the central cities had very considerable percentages. And let me do this. Let me turn this into a 2-page so you can see where I'm going with this. All right, so let's go to the next page, okay? Here it is. A foreign-born population. The foreign-born in the major cities and the non-white populations with which they were in juxtaposition were New York had 22% foreign-born and 9% non-white. Chicago 14%, 14.5%, and non-white was 13%. You had Los Angeles had foreign-born of 12.5% and non-white 8.7%. Philadelphia 11.2%, non-white 18.2%. Detroit 14.9%, and non-white was 16.2%. Boston 17.9%, non-white 4.1%. So here you have the proximity of non-whites and foreign-born, when it did not yield an uneasy tolerance, produced confused resentment and hostility. The happy 4th of July picture of hearty co-citizenship among all groups is misleading. While practical tolerance usually functions, the attitudes and opinions underlying it are crude and well laced with antagonism. Okay, so although many immigrants have relaxed racial feelings, others have for years replenished the ranks of race consciousness. Immigrants from the old world were no doubt tutored in the fine points of racial distinction by the Native Americans. Those with foreign-born ties were usually no less susceptible to prejudice and racial antagonism than the native-born citizens of long standing. Their concentration in the ethnic pockets gave ample social expression to their willingness to reject intrusion and adhere to group loyalties. These groups became key factors in shaping the course of Negro movements through urban residual areas. In many places, they rebuffed non-white entry into their areas or deflected it to other neighborhoods. At times, they would form walls of resistance to non-white movement, or became swift invaders of non-white infiltration by moving away in concerted and disciplined fashion. The ethnic communities of the large cities have constituted an obstacle course through which the non-whites have had no move, now displacing, now surrounding, now outflanking the immigrant islands of foreign language concentrations. Then you have obstacle course. The primary concentration of the relationship of foreign language communities to non-white population is that the immigrant neighborhoods had usually been physically contagious or in opposition in non-white concentrations. The Negro and the foreign language immigrants shared the limitations of income that forced them both to accept the older housing in the areas close to the center of the city. For the Negro, this condition has more enduring. He remained confined, often while a succession of foreign born groups came and went through the old neighborhoods. This physical proximity is important. It meant that the two types of minority groups, racial and lingual, were often in competition for the same shabby tenements and backstreet houses. The foreign-born groups were often accustomed from their European background to working within circumscribed physical conditions. Their diligence and ingenuity, would be lavished upon tiny areas that, however poor they seemed by general American standards, still represented relative comfort and security for the immigrant. As the foreign-born groups thinned out, they tended to shrink their concentrations or yield territory to others. Growing Negro population often filled the abandoned Irish, Italian, or Slavic areas. But in order for the Negro to gain access to the general channels of urban movement, he frequently had to overcome or somehow bypass a traditional rooted core of immigrant resistance. These immigrant communities served as barriers against Negro mobility for the rest of the city population. Examples of such roadblocks to Negro movements could be seen in St. Louis around 1930, where Germans, Jews, Poles, and Italians bordered the Negro district west of the Mississippi. The Polish Principality of Hamtramck in Detroit has for years been impenetrable by Negroes. The ethnic ghettos along Franklin Street in North Philly have long prevented the eastward movement of Negroes. The physical confrontation of the Negro and the white minority groups have been fraught with social factors that bedeviled the relationship. The foreign-born were often not sure of themselves at all in their new urban environment. Many were unused to democracy and its concepts of social and racial equality. Upon achieving some status in this new country, they felt they could not afford to have it undermined by mixing with the stigmatized non-white group. Although it at times sensitive to discrimination themselves, they were in too precarious a social position to let this permit a softening in their own attitude towards non-whites. The foreign-born groups were beset with many internal conflicts, and it was an easy response to direct hostility against the non-whites. The social conflicts and tensions accompanying the process of adjustments of the foreign-born to urban life tended to produce crime and delinquency, which sometimes exceedingly dangerous when radical incidents took place. To the tightly knit foreign-born groups, the Negro was often a strange and dreadful creature. They would have less knowledge of him than even the native white American. He could not be another European like the rest of the minorities. He would not have the elaborate rituals and customs of the Europeans, but would seem to defy any cultural definition. As a competitor for jobs, space, and facilities, he was a threat. It is evident, then, that among the group antagonism in America, the American cities, the relationship between the Negro and the foreign-born presented special difficulties. But this is all in the past. It was acted out in the early part of the century, some would say. This is too facile a judgment The foreign-born communities have been tenacious. Some have thrived for generations. In addition to the foreign-born persons in this group, the second and third generation offsprings are often strongly identified with ethnic ties. The information that follows should be in no way construed as indicative of any thoroughgoing social malady in the groups discussed. These groups all have remarkable qualities and have made remarkable contributions to American life. Their difficulties with the racial question, though more severe and more immediate because of their physical proximity to Negro occupied areas, are part of the more general vexation of our society on this issue. We will look then at some of the groups whose positions in the urban demographic pattern expose them to the rest of the tolerance on race relations. The Poles. People with race relations experience contend that Polish neighborhoods are particularly resistant to racial change and are likely to react violently to incursion by non-whites. Areas of Polish immigrant or other Slavic concentration have been the scenes of some of the most notable outbursts of racial violence in northern cities. Violence in Detroit is often ascribed to Polish elements, as were outbreaks in Cicero, Illinois, adjacent to Chicago. And I did a podcast on that when a black family, well-to-do black family, moved in a Cicero neighborhood, they burnt down the darn gone building. And he was a World War I veteran. I'll share that with you later. The Poles are noted as a highly individualistic people, a people caught in historic contradiction. The history of the mother country may be very significant in explaining the Polish attitude towards group relationships in this country. Poland's shifting borders in political life had embraced a number of traditionally hostile ethnic and nationality groups. Within Poland, there have been in modern times a variety of populations coexisting in uneasy polity. Lithuanians, Estonians, German-speaking element, Ukrainians, White Russians, Jews, and various Balkan strains have lived in Polish territory intermittently. The Poles have had a difficult time to look at it from their viewpoint, with a long historical succession of fury, separatists, unyielding, foreign language, and ethnic minorities. This account for some of the furious qualities of Polish nationalism with such a legacy of intergroup difficulties. It is not surprising that Poles did not come to the polyglot American city with a bland attitude towards minority neighbors in the New World. Okay? So you see, there's some history dealing with the Poles. And I'm not going to keep reading through all of this word by word. But as you go over here to the second page, second paragraph, moreover, it says Polish families usually devote a great deal of energy and thrive to the care dwellings. The house is a family project and all share with its improvement. In such areas as Detroit Hamtramck, which has stood as an all-white area adjacent to Negro concentrations for years, the steady improvement of the housing is a tribute to the hard work of immigrant families. The reaction of such families to the encroachment of Negroes, whose residential history has been one of privation, is strongly resentful. So anytime you get near them, they're going to resent you and they act out violently. The Poles, who, for the most part, live in neighborhoods that have not been entered by Negro families and are said to be determined to resist, with violence if necessary, any Negro invasion of the area they inhabited. Political commitment in Polish neighborhoods have vocally associated themselves with this attitude. In other words, we don't want you here. It's our neighborhood. This has always been our history to act out violently if you try to infiltrate. As a minority group, the Poles have not fared as well in the American immigrant sweepstakes as others. Bold points. that the second generation Poles in the United States have actually a lower socio-economic status than the first generation. Okay. You go further down in this paragraph where it says the Jews and Irish do well in increasing the level of school years completed between first and second generation. Italians and other complete fewer years in school. These factors will certainly have an influence upon the race relationship of the group. A deprivation of the social status would heighten the likelihood of the Poles will feel a need to be a scapegoat. Okay, so it goes on further about the Poles' dilemmas. Then if you go down with the Italians, the beginning of this paragraph, the Italians of all immigrant groups, the Italians are most symbolic with the 20th century of the great American experience of immigration. All right? Second paragraph, the Italian neighborhoods with their accompanying churches, fraternal lodges, Italian food shops, and gregarious family life have not been confined to older, large city areas. All right, that's why you have your little Italies. All right. So it says right here, many smaller industrial towns in the east, fruit growing areas in the west coast, and food processing centers have strong Italian communities. We are most concerned, however, with the Italian occupied areas adjoining Negro districts. These older neighborhoods usually derive their Italian character from the first wave of immigration from southern Italy, beginning in the 1800s and reaching its height in the early years of the century, which I find ironic, seeing as though a lot of your southern Italians got African in them anyway because of Hannibal and all of the infiltration of the Africans in southern area. But anyway. It says right here, you go further down the paragraph, employment was found in railroad construction and the garment trades and the building trades and food industries. Okay? So one striking feature of the Italian residential blocks have been the housing improvement that has been taking place under private initiative. The extensive engagement of Italians in building trades meant that the families usually had valuable skills available. The men could cut stone, lay brick, and cement, and do a great number of things, and so on and so on. Okay? But then you look further down this paragraph, it says, look at my hand right here. Owing to the association of Negroes with shabby, deteriorated housing, the financial and emotional investment of Italian householder was felt to be in jeopardy when Negroes encroached. You see the pattern? All right, so we're going to go over here to the second on the right hand side, second paragraph, where it says in 1960 and early 1961, two cities provided examples of incidents involving Italians and Negroes. The incidents were largely independent of one another, but their combined impact on the respective Italian and Negro groups should be considered carefully because the outbreaks formed a clear sequence in popular opinion. So what happens is in Philadelphia in May of 1960, a high school boy, an Italian boy by the name of John Capigla, was killed by a wolf pack attack of Negro youth. And the killing was utterly senseless and the victim utterly innocent. Public opinion in the Italian community was inflamed. They get upset about it. And a series of small fights and retaliatory shotgun attacks took place shortly afterwards in the same section of the city. Unfortunately, the shotgun blast only slightly injured a Negro girl in the steps on a Baptist church. In 1960, a young policeman named Marinelli was called to a melee in heavily Negro area of North Philly. He leaned from the door on his patrol wagon and fired his gun repeatedly at a fleeing man. He killed not only the man but a woman near him. Both victims were Negroes. So you see there's the tension, okay? There was constant tension when anywhere black folks were go into or encroach in an area that is highly populated with a lot of the foreign immigrants. Okay. Of course, He killed not only one man but a woman near him. Both victims were Negro. Both of them was innocent of any offense. Negro community opinions was outraged. February of 1961, while the trial of the killers of John Capiglia was in progress, the son of a civic leader in South Philadelphia named Ionelli was beaten by a teenage gang of Negroes. The boy's father had been a worker for better race relations. In 1961, a teenager named Cerrone was stabbed by Negro boys after basketball. So you see the tension. Okay? So let's go further. Let's speed this up. Let's go down. So I've already kind of like really gave you an understanding or a picture of what was going on between Negroes and Poles and Negroes and Italians. So we're going to go to this next paragraph, the second paragraph, the Jews. Jewish people are wise in the ways of the city. They have for centuries been an urban people. The ghetto was named after them. Time after time, they have been racial antagonism mounting city streets. It is improbable, however, that they have ever encountered on such a large scale the kind of problem presented by the urbanization of American Negroes. The entire social life of the population movement was slow. Today, their swift movement resulted in metropolitan centers. In this setting, the large Jewish population of the struggle to resolve the American dilemma of race relations. One of the places in which Negroes confront Jews is in the corner store. Why? Because, once again, another immigrated group controls a business in our communities. In many of the great segregated districts, the last outposts of the white residents are the grocers, small dry goods stores, pharmacies, which are in many cases owned and operated as family businesses by modestly prosperous Jewish families. Because of their economical stake in these small businesses, the owners have frequently been reluctant to leave areas which have changed racially. So they're tied to their community for the most part. Okay? In this circumstance, and if you go further down in the next paragraph, in these circumstances, the Jewish storekeeper is often the only white man many Negroes see as a regular basis. He is a person who gives service, but often he is also a family creditor to whom the grocery bill is owed. All right. The amount of anti-Semitism that may grow out of this latter relationship is surprising. We've talked about that if you go back to some of my videos about this whole anti-Semite thing. And if anyone is listening, if you can tell me what a Semite is, we can go further in this conversation too. All right. As the last white resident on the block and sections were existence in less than Gentile, it is understandably that small shopkeepers should at times feel the pressure of minority groups frustrated and counter prejudice. Now, I will say this: there's good people everywhere, but you cannot go by the whole idea that everybody is innocent either. Okay, but there is some good people out there, no matter what their background is, and I gotta really reiterate that. But that's not the point of this video. A second sphere of influence in which Negroes and Jews interact is those heavily Jewish neighborhoods that have begun to change racially. The sequence of migrations of minority groups through our cities have often placed Negroes next in line to Jews in social status and home buying ability. Neighborhoods once forbidden to Jews have received substantial influxes of Jewish homeowners. Some of that also is because once they begin to move in, they kind of strong arm other people to move out so they can buy that building. They're doing that in Crown Heights, New York right now. Throughout Brownsville, Red Hook, all of that area. I used to hang out in Red Hook when I was 15. Right, so Red Hook is different than what it is now. I used to hang out in Crown Heights back in the early 90s. The aspiring Negro sees in these areas the same virtues of middle class respectability that Jewish families fresh from the immigrant Jews town saw in them a generation ago. All right. So here we have another class of people moving into these communities. All right. Let's go further down. Let's kind of speed this up. Where it says the problem of a synagogue in a racially changing area should also be noted. Unlike many Christian denominations, the Jews do not proselytize. The synagogue congregation cannot absorb incoming Negro families the way a corrective correctly oriented Roman Catholic or a congregation or Methodist church can. In other words, they do not allow Negroes in their churches. I've expressed that to you before in my video. All right, in my PowerPoint presentation. You cannot be mixed. You can't be mulatto. You can't be Negro. Period. They don't accept you in there. And Dr. Ben talks about that a lot too. All right. So, and the reduction in the congregation due to the removal of a Jewish family is likely to be permanent. All right. If a sufficient proportion of the congregation migrates, it may be economically mandatory for the temple to follow. So if so many of them move out of the neighborhood, then they're just going to go ahead and just move the synagogue with them. It's not going to stay in a neighborhood that's not predominantly them because they don't want any other group of people to infiltrate. The third sphere, second paragraph, the third sphere in which Negroes and Jews are particularly linked is not so much physically as it is one of the social psychology. The Negro and the Jews are both members of a minority group that experience a sore tolerance of actual ill treatment on the American scene. This fact has been brought forth a source of kinship or practical affinity between Jews and Negroes. Based on their common concern for fair treatment and democratic rights, hence Jewish and Negro organizations can usually be found working together for civil rights, fair employment, intergroup understanding, and racial integration. And in some circumstances, I will agree with that. Okay? So here you have another line of group of people that are coming in. All right? So move over to the right-hand side, you start talking about the Puerto Ricans. Although Puerto Rican immigration to the mainland has not brought about a great dispersion of Spanish-speaking people, generally through the eastern cities. And mind you, let me remind everyone, this is not my work. This is the work of the author, Mr. Clark. So I'm just sharing this article with you and what he wrote in 1963. Here it is. It has resulted in strong Puerto Rican concentrations in the old neighborhoods of Philadelphia, Chicago, Bridgeport, and above all, New York. The influx has thus placed the Puerto Ricans in some of the major urban cities in which are today vast laboratories of social tension and racial change. Placed beside American Negroes are intermingled with them, the Puerto Ricans have been very confused in their racial attitudes. Their Hispanic backgrounds have endowed them with a rather casual attitude towards race. This attitude is subtle. In the mainland cities, the keen consciousness of race among the general population forces Puerto Ricans to question their own tradition in racial matters, and frequently to adopt a more decisive attitude towards racial differences. In response, the mainland aberrations, but this is done with much confusion. All right? And I like it because, like some groups, you're going to eventually start losing your identity of culture because you're going to assimilate. I mean, that's just only natural, especially when there's some commonality in culture. You know, when you definitely know the heritage history of Puerto Ricans being a mix of, indigenous Indians, African, and Spanish. Whether someone to admit it or not, that's on them. So racial distinctions in Puerto Rico are mild, but they are there. The Spanish terms of El Blanco, white, El Indio, dark skin with straight hair, El Grifo, white coloring, but with hair or features of a Negro cat. You see the terminology that they're coming with? They're trying to break down the classism of what type of Puerto Rican are you? Are you going to be white? Are you going to be dark skinned with straight hair? Are you white coloring, but you got hair or features of Negro cast? With the curly hair, kinky hair, but you light skinned. El bien Trujillano, a fairer, Negro. Are you light skinned like mulatto? And the use of these terms, El Negro, as a word of opprobrium, reflected the different values ascribed to racial visibility on the island. Colorism. No different than what we're going through. They're going through the same thing. That's why you may see a dark-skinned Puerto Rican, they talking about they ain't black. It's the mindset. It's colorism. And then I know some light skinned Puerto Ricans like, yo, I got African in me, so I love it. You know what I mean? So it all depends. The acute in this group feeling and loyalty to Puerto Rican communities introduces the Hispano to reject the American Negro on double grounds. You see? First, as an outsider, and second, as a symbol of and a target for racial discrimination with which it would be unwise to be identified. The Spanish speaking Puerto Rican of dark color is fraternally treated, except perhaps on the mainland where there is a question of intimate or permanent relationships. But the American Negro is an interloper, a threat, a puzzle. The fact that similar disabilities afflict both groups in many ways only heightens the Puerto Ricans' resentment against the American Negro. Thus, Puerto Ricans may resent appeals against prejudice and discrimination which link American Negroes and Hispanos. All right? So now you see you got more tensions between the Negro and Puerto Ricans. Okay? So here it is. If you go further down, third paragraph, while Hispanos and Negroes may resent one another, their residential association is constantly enforced. The Puerto Ricans are recently arrived in the cities and are so many Southern Negroes. Landlords are seldom capable of according the group separate status. They're looking so much like one another that he can't really tell the difference. All right? So, let's speed it up a little bit. Where he goes on to say the Negro neighborhoods adjoining the white minority communities have an ambiguous set of attitudes towards their distant neighbors. Okay. And then, of course, on the one hand, the immigrants are subject to some discrimination, as is the Negro. In some ways, relationships may be casual and unprejudiced. Negroes may shop in the curbside Italian markets or go to the school with Puerto Ricans or realize that Jewish organizations are pro-integration. On the other hand, there will be a recognition that the immigrants do constitute a group by themselves. Okay? So, let's kind of skip over a little bit. Then you start talking about the Muslim and black nationalist groups, which have been widely publicized in recent years in a verse, but that's something else. Now you start getting into the last group, right? Well, not the last group, the next group, the native whites. Although we have concentrated our attention upon foreign-born groups in this chapter, it should not be inferred that cohesive native-born neighborhoods are not a frequent source of trouble. The problems arising from neighborhoods with a high percentage of Appalachian mountaineers have been of considerable concern in some cities. That's where your boy Lincoln is from. He was a Melungeon. He didn't want to admit it, but he was a Melungeon. They're mixed with African, Portuguese, white, Indian, stuff like that. They're dark-skinned people. Okay, a lot of them are anyway, up in the Appalachians. So here you have. Let's go. I want to get to the meat and potatoes of this article. Okay. Last paragraph. There are forces at work in native-born neighborhoods that, on occasion, can produce agitated waves of racial feelings. Although much areas seldom hold the same violence potential as immigrant communities, the insecurity of the junior executive suburb is an example. In a suburb of breadwinners may transfer a household head to another city or short notice. Okay? So here you have the shifting population of the urban centers will alter the residential makeup in the central city areas. Only vestige of the immigrant communities will remain. Okay? Let's skip down further. The day of the immigrant neighborhoods may be fading fast, but these areas have had a strategic significance in the last 2 decades in their effect upon non-white urban movements. They represent a notable interlude in intergroup relationship. The lessons we can learn from them should not be readily forgotten.